everybody talks about all President Bush cared about was foreign policy, not domestic policy. And, I'm like, wait a minute, he's got two incredibly huge domestic policy accomplishments. One was the Federal Clean Air Act, which I grew up in L.A. with Stage 3 smog alerts. And the second was the Americans with Disabilities Act. And if you think about it, that is the largest civil rights legislation in the history of the country. It affects more people, you think about it, it affects more people than same-sex marriage and LGBT rights. It affects more people actually than even African Americans in the American, 60s. In that civil rights movement, literally affects tens of millions of people.
I had forgotten that. I didn't know that. That was George Bush's.
And he was working on that when he was VP and signed it when he was president. And, it literally means that people can actually go to the bathroom. They can get off a curb. They can't be fired or denied employment if they get a disability. They got to make reasonable accommodations. People in his own party were against it because it was going to cost money to business. And he's like, this is a civil rights issue.
How is it for you being on the White House staff and watching kind of the stress of the presidency? I mean, they all are impacted in different ways.
So actually, that's a great question because a lot of folks say, boy, the pictures of the before and the after when they go into the office, how young they look, and when they come out, how old and beaten up they look. And I will tell you, President Bush thrived. He was a person who thrived for competition. He played baseball, almost drafted as a baseball player at Yale. Every sport he was competitive in, and he was competitive in his job as president. He was competitive with other foreign heads of state. He was competitive with people in the legislature. And so as some people would, wither or get old or impacted by stress, it was just the opposite for him. It was like energy and that drove him forward. And so he thrived on the stress, and he was the most calm person when the chips were really down. When the Gulf War came out, I remember we were really, really knocking the tar out of Saddam Hussein. And then Saddam Hussein launched Scud missiles into Israel. And that could have changed the entire dynamic of the war if the Israelis would have come in and tried to counterattack the Iraqis. And the president very calmly, through himself and his national security advisor, talked to the Israelis not to counterattack. He managed the war. He kept 30-plus coalition countries involved in the war. And again, just smooth. And again, the more under pressure the country was under, the more George Bush thrived as a stable element.
As you travel to Texas and are at the funeral that will be held there for President Bush, what will you remember most about him?
Two things. Number one, I will remember that he did what he thought was right always. And so he made that pledge, read my lips, no new taxes, but he thought that the country needed a tax increase at that time because with that tax increase came entitlement reform, and it stabilized the budget. He did not take a victory lap after he had the Berlin Wall torn down and the Soviet Union dissolved because he knew that could hurt. They transitioned from a communist environment in Europe to a democratic one in Europe. And so both of those issues cost him in large part the presidency. And his political advisors were giving him the counsel to do just the opposite. They were giving the counsel to attack Bill Clinton. They said, nope, it's too important for the world and too important for the country. I'm going to do what's right. And he lost the presidency. And you saw that in everything he did. He did what was right when he was dealing with his children. The love and affection that they had. He did what was right dealing with his wife. He did what was right with dealing with all of his staffers. Me, myself, every time I had a child, 3 of them now, about 2 weeks to a month afterwards, a letter would come in the mail from him congratulating me on the birth of our kid and talking a little bit about what I was like when I worked with him. Just an extraordinary human being who cared about people who worked for him. And he was more loyal, I would say, to his staff than his staff was to him. And I will tell you, his staff was pretty darn loyal to him.
Is there anything I haven't asked you that you think is important to say?
I think what's important to say is, we live in times that are so, acrimonious between the media and the president, this president. And my hope is that certainly this president grows in the job and just does not lash out constantly. But I also hope that the media actually takes a step back and doesn't attack this president all the time as well. President Bush and President Reagan, they took their lumps from the media often. If they made mistakes, even simple malaprops, the media beat up on them. But President Reagan and President Bush showed the dignity of the office and did not lash back out at the press as much as any human being wants to lash out when they're attacked. So my hope for the greater good of the country is that people look at not just how the President Bush comported himself with the public and his compassion, but how he dealt with the media and how the media dealt with him. And I think that's a lesson that the media can learn today, and it's a lesson that the president sitting in the Oval Office can learn as well.